So Simo Ahava is a recognized expert on customizing web analytics and tag management solutions to improve the entire life cycle of data collection, processing, and reporting. As I'm sure you know, his main areas of expertise lie with Google Analytics and Tag Manager. This is where I came across him in Tag Manager. Go Google Plus group. Lots of talk already in the chat about Google Plus and bringing that back. Google, maybe. Google's actually appointed him a Google developer expert in both Tag Manager and Analytics. He's especially interested in communication structures within organizations, a popular topic. I'm sure he'd be willing to answer questions maybe even about that. Making sure that communications within organizations is improved, because he firmly believes that those breakdowns are some of the underlying causes to practically all data-related problems. He's particularly interested in demystifying analytics and specifically the development work, and his main focus is on increasing awareness, skills, and critical thinking around data and deployment, which means don't just copy and paste the scripts, but always trust but verify, understand how they work, and his blogs are phenomenal at that. I'm sure you are already a follower of his blog, simoahava.com. He is also partner and co-founder in 8-Bit Sheep, and of course, an experienced speaker and prolific blogger. You can also find him on Twitter at Simo Ahava, of LinkedIn, which is linkedin.com/Simo Ahava, and on Google Plus, if they ever bring it back, plus Simo Ahava. Let's go ahead and chat room, give him a plus Simo Ahava. Welcome Simo Ahava to Measure Summit 2020.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. This is the official plus symbol for Google Plus people. It's not like a crucifix, and I'm trying to exercise Mercer. Anyway, I'm pretty stoked. I mean, this is it's been quite a nervous getting to this point where I'm from what I heard, this is the first live presentation on Measure Summit. So I'm extremely honored to test the tech waters, be the guinea pig to see if this actually works. So my topic is server-side tagging in Google Tag Manager, and this won't be an end-to-end workshop about server-side tagging, obviously. We're going to talk about what server-side tagging means for the Google stack. Yeah, we're going to be talking about what it means for organizations, what it looks like, what are its main, benefits and concerns. But what I really want to do is just run through this presentation and get to the Q&A, because I have a feeling like that's where the most interesting insights will come from people asking questions and us trying to figure out what's going on. So I basically just dissed my entire presentation, but it's going to be good. I promise it's going to be worth it. So let's get going. I'm really embarrassed about presenting anything anymore, because I saw Leah Pika's talk on how to build successful and interesting presentations, and I realized that I'm failing at every single one of her commandments. I did remove the bullets, so I think I'm ahead of the game in that sense. But we'll start with, why are we talking about server-side tagging? What is server-side tagging as opposed to? And at the other end of the scale, we have what we call regular tagging, what we've been doing thus far. So we have a website, and we're going to be talking about web now exclusively. We're not going to be dragging apps into this, just to keep things running smoothly. But when we talk about regular tagging, we have a website. And on that website, we have GTM, or we have a tag manager, a tagging system running. And this tagging system is loaded from a third-party CDN typically. So from Google servers, we download the Google Tag Manager library, which is then executed on the site, and it does its tricks. At the same time, we have these different endpoints. We can call them vendors just for simplicity. So we have things like Facebook and Google Analytics and Google Ads, and we need to collect some information into these endpoints. So the regular tagging approach is to dispatch requests to these vendors, and then these vendors might respond with something. And every single vendor requires their own request and response chain. So this is typically, in GTM terms, we're creating a tag for Facebook, we're creating a tag for Universal Analytics, we're creating a tag for Google Ads. And all those tags represent some kind of communication that goes between the site and the vendor. Now, the problem with this approach, it works fine. That's why GTM has been so successful over the years, and that's why tagging is a thing. This works perfectly. There's from a data collection point, or perfectly is the wrong word, but from a data collection point of view, this is fine as a status quo. But when you start looking at this stream of requests and responses more critically, you start seeing things that might not make a lot of sense in today's world. For the first thing, you're communicating with CDNs. So most of these endpoints represent some type of content distribution network. Typically, you're downloading a JavaScript library. So before you send anything to Facebook, you download their SDK into the browser. Before you send anything to Google Analytics, you download the analytics library. Before you send anything to Google Ads, you download some library that helps you do this stuff. And when you're communicating with a CDN, you are basically subservient to the whims of that CDN. If the CDN falls down or breaks, you might not get anything in response. If it's really slow or lagging, you might not be able to build those hits in time when the user has already left the page. So you're basically just hoping for the best that these CDNs don't break on you. The other thing is that all of these requests and responses represent a potential cookie through line. So third-party cookies can be written on these domains to which these requests are being sent. And then if they're running in your own domain namespace, then these JavaScript libraries can basically write whatever cookies they want in the client. And cookies themselves aren't evil in any way, but we can use them for evil purposes. But what cookies do represent is overload. It's weight on top of your basically the bandwidth that your site needs to run, because every single cookie is included in those requests for same site domains. So the kind of purpose, what you want to do is try to minimize the number of cookies. But because you're loading third-party JavaScript, you have no control over what kind of cookies they're dropping. And obviously, third-party tracking leads to cross-site tracking. So these vendors can build comprehensive profiles of you, follow you with advertisements and products wherever you browse on the web. Whether this is good or bad is obviously something you get to decide for yourself. But the current mood of tracking protections and legislation is that there are inherent problems with cross-site tracking. And then we have things like tracker pings, cross-site scripting attacks, PII leaks. All of these are introduced by the erratic reality of HTTP requests and responses to a third-party domain. So this is what regular tagging is. There's nothing broken about it, but there are lots of inherent risks involved that can balloon into performance issues, data breaches, GDPR violations, all sorts of things that you might not know about. So this is where server-side tagging comes in. And server-side tagging introduces a bit of a different paradigm for this. We still have a website. And this is just, again, I'm reiterating, this is just a case of web tracking. You can do server-side tracking for lots of different things, for, apps, cars, smart refrigerators, anything that can send an HTTP request can communicate with the server-side tagging endpoint. But in this point of view, we still have a website and we still have our vendors. But now, instead of communicating directly with the vendors, we introduce something in between. And the thing in between is your server container or your server-side proxy. So the website is communicating with this block in the middle. And the block in the middle then chooses what to dispatch to these vendors. And this is the fundamental difference. And the key thing here is that the green area on the screen represents something that you own and you control. Everything sent through the website aimed at the vendors eventually passes through something that you own and you control. So you have full control over the data flows in this sense. And this gives you purpose for things like hit validation. You can look at the incoming requests to the server from the website and validate them if they should be sent forward to the vendors in the first place. For example, if the universal analytics hit has invalid fields or is missing a custom dimension or doesn't have a client ID, you can basically abort the hit there and then. You don't have to experience the overhead of sending it to Google Analytics only for it to be discarded. Or if Facebook hit is missing the Facebook cookie or user email or any way to identify the user, it makes no sense to send to Facebook because it can't do anything with the information. So you can validate those hits before they are dispatched and you can fix them as well. You can add the missing bits and pieces in the server container. Stream consolidation is a very interesting concept. It basically means that instead of your website sending 3 different streams, one to Facebook, one to GA, one to ads, only a single stream is sent to the server container, a single hit. And that hit is then fanned to all these different endpoints. That single hit is just mapped to a Facebook hit, a Google Analytics hit, and a Google Ads hit. Because when you look at a thing like a purchase conversion, the semantic content of that conversion hit is practically identical when you compare Facebook, Google Analytics, and Google Ads. The only things that change are the names of the parameters, some of the values, and maybe some of the cookie identifiers or something. But the majority of the content is the same. You know, it was a purchase hit, it was 15 euros in value, currency code was euro. That's shared by all these vendors. So you don't need to send the same information 3 times from the website. You can just send it once and have the server container kind of fan that out to all the different endpoints. Anonymization is a very important part of the server container. You know of the anonymized IP feature of Universal Analytics, which basically means that when Universal Analytics processes your hit, it removes the last part of the IP address, and that's how they anonymize the hit. The problem is that the HTTP request still contains the entire IP address, the user agent, and maybe other fingerprintable items as well. Same thing for Facebook and Google Ads. They get the full HTTP header payload when your website is sending those hits. And that's not anonymized data at all. But what the server container does is, because that's now in the middle, what Facebook, Google Ads, and Google Analytics actually see is your server container's IP address and the server container's user agent. You would have to manually copy the IP and the user agent from the incoming request from the website for it to be passed on to Google or Facebook. So you can completely obfuscate the user and the browser by simply allowing the server container to be the thing that these vendors see. Then we have things like content management, client-side performance, which are things that server container can help with. You know, content management no longer has to be done in the browser itself. You can look at those cookies in the server container and then decide what to do with the data. Client-side performance is something I'll discuss in a separate part of this presentation. And then we have this tracking protection. It's not a typo. I literally mean that. So we have things like intelligent tracking prevention, which targets JavaScript cookies on Safari browsers and some other browsers on mobile devices as well. But when you're using a server container, you can overcome that by using HTTP cookies instead. Just an example of the things that the server container can give you, just for get a bit better data quality. So what's the, if we want to add this thing in the middle, what are the actual reasons in addition to the quick overview that I just listed? So the biggest thing is this idea that you have full ownership and control of the data. Now, obviously, you have to trust what the Google Cloud Platform promises you when you say that you own the data, or when they say that you own the data. If you're a Google skeptic, you obviously might not believe a single word they say, and at that point, you know, I don't think server-side tagging for now is the right tool for you. However, do note that Google Tag Manager server-side tagging will be portable, hopefully in the near future. It's basically run on a container already, so it can be ported to AWS or Azure or whatever you want to use, or even on premises if you really want to keep that tinfoil hat really tight on your head. But for now, we're using Google Cloud, and they do give you pretty strong promises about data ownership, and they do own quite a bit of infrastructure on the web. So I would personally, I'm inclined to trust them on when they say this. The idea of reduced client load comes up again, and like I said, I'm going to return to this in a bit. So I'm not going to dwell here any longer, except to point out that what you see is entirely possible. Reduce that third-party JavaScript crap that's being downloaded by the site, megabytes of data, and just squeeze that all into a single stream of data with your own lightweight JavaScript handling everything. Content security policies are things that many of us have to struggle with whenever we work in tag management and we want to add a new vendor, for example. We need to put in a ticket to IT to get the CSP relaxed a bit, just so that this new vendor endpoint can be communicated with. The problem with this is that every single vendor, every single host name in the content security policy diminishes the usefulness of the CSP. You're basically allowing backdoors onto the site by introducing these. So by reducing the number of third-party script running on the site, you're doing a favor to your governance, your IT governance, because you'll only be running your own server container rather than, you don't need Google Analytics there. You don't need whatever else here is Google APIs. You don't need Vimeo, because you can run all that stuff through the server container, through your own domain. Some cool things you can do is you can actually process a lot of things that are never visible to the browser. You can add passwords and secret API keys, communicate with authentication APIs without having to worry about the user in the browser seeing your secrets, because this is all happening behind the veil of the server and it's not visible in the browser at all. And you can utilize the full power of the HTTP response request chain. So you can do things like write cookies in those responses. You can proxy JavaScript libraries, like you can, instead of downloading analytics.js from Google servers, you can download it from your server container by first loading it into the server container from Google servers. So you can move your tracking and all your script downloads to a first party context. So having said all that, there's a lot of huge benefits for organizations right there, but there has to be something fishy. It sounds too good to be true. So let's take a look at what the key concerns are. And this is obviously a very divisive topic, but I am firmly and to the very last cell in my body of sound mind and purpose of the opinion that if you're looking at server-side GTM as an ad or a content blocker circumvention system, you've got it wrong and you're misusing the system. It's a very tempting idea. By moving all those third-party scripts to your own domain, it's a very tempting idea that you're finally able to not have your data streams blocked by those pesky content blockers and those browser tracking protections. I do not think this is a good incentive to do anything. I think that if users want to block tracking, they are entitled to block tracking. Unfortunately, there's no mechanism in server-side GTM to recognize ad blockers. So it's very difficult to be compliant in that way. It's very difficult to respect the user's wishes because their ad blocker just isn't sophisticated enough to, block this stuff. So I hope, and I'm pretty sure this will happen, ad blockers will become more sophisticated. And instead of looking blankly at domains, they'll start looking at what you're actually sending to those domains. And they'll start like removing identifiers and removing known cookies from those requests. The other thing, that side effect that comes from this is that data collection itself is really opaque. We don't know what happens in the server. We have no visibility to that in the browser. We only know that some hits are being sent to the server and maybe they're sent to Facebook, maybe they're sent to Google Ads. So imagine a situation where you're asked for consent and you say that I'm fine with you sending data to GA, but I don't want you to send data to Facebook. And then you see a single stream of data moving from the browser to the server that just has an event name is purchase, currency is euro, and value is 10 euros. There's no way for you to know as a browser user whether that hit will be used for Facebook or not, even if you gave consent. So this introduces a new level of trust, because when the browser was communicating directly with Facebook, you could always look at the browser, you could look at Facebook tools, and you could look at network requests and see that, hey, these guys are not respecting my consent. They're actually sending data to Facebook. But now, because it's shifted to the server, it doesn't change the legal reality of things. You're still accountable for all this stuff, but it makes it easier to be the bad guy at this point. It makes it easier to do black hat stuff. And this will certainly be a pain point for Google when they're trying to promote this tool, especially in privacy, for a privacy-oriented crowd, because of this opaqueness. At the moment, this is just a very simple thing that's missing for now, but there's no built-in consent management. So I wish there was, but right now the way it works is that you basically have to just use the available APIs and look at what cookies are sent with those requests. And if those cookies don't have certain consents, then basically you just prevent stuff from happening. But this is a very technical endeavor at the moment. You would have to code these templates yourself. There's no generic consent management template that would be able to handle all the custom templates in server-side tagging. So hopefully we'll see some improvements for consent management when it comes to server-side tagging. Then there's obviously the cost. So if you're running a full production ready setup, it's going to cost you around 3.5 to 4 euros a day, assuming you don't blow past that you don't need to scale the setup up. So that's about 110, 120 euros a month. This is if you don't need scale up. But as soon as you're ingesting more data and doing more complicated things in the server, you'll start seeing spikes in the cost graph. And at that point, it can cost a lot more. Just to give you an idea of the ballpark for larger sites, I have a client collecting around 10 million hits a day, and they're paying around 3 times as much as you see here. So 300 euros a month, which to me doesn't sound too bad when you consider the amount of hits they're actually recycling through the system. This example is from my own blog. I don't have the accurate hit counts for you, but we're talking significantly less than 10 million a day. Some thousands a day maybe, but for that, the cost is around this. So the cost can be prohibitive. There are ways to optimize the cost, and I've added a link here, and I'll obviously share the slides, but there's a link there that will help you disable logging, which turns out is one of the most costly things, but it only applies if you're actually forcing the instances to scale up. Obviously, there's a poor availability of server-to-server endpoints. All the big players have them, so Facebook, Google, for most of their tools, but even Google doesn't have one for Floodlight because there really isn't a way for Floodlight to work at the moment without the third-party cookie. And I'm not sure if they're brave enough to do what Facebook is doing, which is to move to a link decoration with identity IDs. They might already be doing that. I don't know that much about that world, but they don't have an official way to do this right now. So there's a poor availability of these endpoints, but now that Google is in the server-side tagging game, I have a feeling that many vendors will jump at the opportunity to introduce those server-to-server endpoints. They want to be in the game. They want that traffic for themselves because it's better quality traffic for them as well. It's not just about the site owner, it's about the vendors as well. And then there's the, like I mentioned, third-party cookies won't work because no longer is your browser the one with the third-party cookie communicating with the vendor, but now it's the server endpoint communicating with the vendor. And Leia would be so proud of me. I have a gradient here at play. So we have a moving from green to red to represent the fact that I'm not actually sure this is a bad thing, because I'm again inclined to accept the fact that third-party cookies are inherently problematic, and they introduce lots of problems in their wake. And so having this by default prevented in server-side tagging, because browsers are preventing them as well, is, in my opinion, a good thing. But if you have a service that relies on third-party cookie that has nothing to do with cross-site tracking or something else, and you want to run it through your server container, then this will obviously be a problem. So now, before I wrap up, I just want to take an example of one of the impacts that server-side tagging can have. And the one that I could have chosen a number of the different benefits, such as, improvements to privacy, improvements to those requests, HTTP requests and responses, and intelligent tracking prevention. But what I wanted to take was this idea that you can actually debloat the site. So you can move those third-party script downloads to first-party instead. You can even remove most of those downloads altogether by consolidating those streams. And if you've been using tools like Lighthouse or Pingdom or PageSpeed Insights, you know how big a problem the impact of third-party code is. They introduce so much download time. And in this example, for example, the hazy screenshot in the background, there's actually main thread blocking time as well. So opt and on type cookie content management system is run synchronously. So it actually blocks the main thread. It blocks the page from correctly rendering until the user has done something. So when we return back to this, let's see what you typically need if you wanted to work without a server-side container and you wanted to send data to Facebook. Well, you need to add Facebook to your content security policy. You need to add facebook.com as a trusted source from which JavaScript can be downloaded and to which these hits can be sent. Then you have to wait for the CDN to respond. Every single time the user browses the site, they have to wait for Facebook CDN to respond with the JavaScript. This might take a long time, or it might take a really short time, but it's overhead nonetheless. It's something the browser has to do just so that your organization can send some stuff to Facebook. The user doesn't care about this one bit, but yet they're forced to suffer through this download. On top of that, Facebook will know that the user has sent a request to them. They will have that HTTP request logged. The user's IP address, the user agent, any other type of stuff that Facebook wants to collect from you without you knowing is going to be logged in their servers. Third-party cookies will be able to activate if your browser supports them, and Facebook will be able to compile a profile of your visit. There's also very little protection against hijack. Facebook is a bad example because they probably have some pretty solid restrictions and protections in place, but smaller vendors can have their endpoint hijacked by an attacker. And then instead of downloading Facebook's JavaScript, you download something that looks like Facebook's JavaScript, but just happens to have a credit card skimmer JavaScript at the end of it. This is how the infamous Mage card hack attacks works. So they hijack domains, they hijack those JavaScript libraries, and they add their malicious code to the end. There's very little to protect against these types of attacks because you've already added them to the CSP, so the browser trusts them. You could do sub-resource integrity checks, but even they are flaky when you talk about a library that can update quite often. And then you have to wait for the script to execute. So when you've downloaded Facebook's JavaScript, the browser has to dedicate resources to execute the script. You have to hope that it doesn't do any performance killing injections. With GTM, it's almost a guarantee that there will be performance killing injections, some hundreds of custom HTML tags firing with every single mouse click on the page. I literally just saw this at a client. So these are all very detrimental to performance, and you just have to hope as a browser user that these sites don't just download all this crazy JavaScript and force your computer to go through all that computation just to satisfy some data collection need. And then, of course, identifiers, cross-site tracking, yada, yada, yada. So let's see what server-side tagging helps. Well, first of all, you don't have to add anything to the CSP. It's going to be running on your own domain namespace. So all you have to do is whitelist or allow list your own subdomain. So you make a single CSP change, and that will cover everything that runs through the server-side container. You don't have to wait for Facebook CDN to respond anymore. Instead, you can actually optimize your server-side container to scale up to respond even faster for certain requests. Or you can have it scale up during the weekends when you have, I'm so bad at examples, when you have a sale for your basketball shoes and you want your site to be really fast, then you can scale up that. You don't have to, you're not a slave to a CDN. You're in full control of how fast your server container is to respond. The HTTP request is no longer logged into Facebook servers. It's logged into your logs, your organization logs, and they're going to stay there. So you're not leaking that information to Facebook. Facebook has no idea what IP address actually sent that data to Facebook. Hijack protection, it's not perfect. If you're still proxying stuff through your server, you can inadvertently download a hijack script and then pass that onto the website. But you can actually run malware checks within the server container and make sure that those libraries don't have their integrity compromised. It's difficult, but it's doable, and it gives you the tools to do that. You don't have to wait for Facebook script to execute. You can optimize it. So instead of a Facebook JavaScript, you can have your own little, 5-line analytics module whose only purpose is to send a purchase hit on the thank you page. And that's the only thing your browser would download. So that's how you optimize it. You consolidate those streams. Then you have to hope for no perf killing injection where you're working with third-party JavaScript. Well, you have an option to prevent perf killing injection. Like I said, you have the full power of what the server container sends back to the website. You can make sure that the scripts that are sent back to the website don't do anything that they're not supposed to do. And then as far as identifiers and cross-site tracking goes, tracking becomes opt-in, not just to the user, but to the site as well. You decide what you want to track. You make the decision on what is trackable. I haven't seen the chat yet, and I still have a couple of minutes before we hit the 30-minute mark. So I added some frequently asked questions that I made them up completely myself, but I have a feeling that these are frequently asked questions. So first thing, does this replace client-side tracking? This question pops up all the time, and it depends. Is going to be my answer to all of these frequently asked questions, but I'll expand that a bit. If you want to track things that happen in the browser, you need something in the browser to send that information, whether it's to a server container or to Facebook. If you want to track scroll events or video play events, you still need something running in the browser. So in that way, server-side tagging certainly doesn't reduce the need to have any client-side tagging, but the nature of client-side tagging changes in that it's not vendor specific. You're not necessarily collecting Google Analytics tags in the browser, but you have your own little analytics module sending that information to the server. So it depends. Is this server-side tracking is another thing that trips people up. We're talking about server-side tagging here. Server-side tracking in the way that many people mean it means that you're actually passing data without ever using a client in between. So things like e-commerce transactions are sent directly from the backend to Google Analytics, or you're parsing server logs and taking page views from them instead of a JavaScript library. And this is certainly not that. This is a tagging system where the purpose is to send that data somewhere. It doesn't collect anything by itself, although it actually does, because it does log everything. But you can turn a server container into a tracking endpoint as well. Once we have things like a BigQuery API, you can just have that server-side container write those rows directly into BigQuery without going through Google Analytics and without complicated authentication systems. Or you can already today look at your HTTP logs in your server container and build an analytics system out of that. So in that sense, yeah, it's server-side tracking, but it still depends. It's not server-side tracking in the way that people typically think about it. Is this legal? It depends. It's a tool. It's a blank slate. It's legal if you make it be legal. It's illegal if you do illegal stuff. There's nothing inherently about the technology that makes it questionable from a legal point of view. It has problems such as the opacity of data collection. That's a problem from a legal point of view, because part of the accountability and compliance system is transparency. It should be clear to the browser user what is collected from them and for what that data is being used. And the fact that data collection is opaque means that it's very tempting to kind of circumvent those users' consent wishes and track them anyway, because there's no way for you to get caught because it happens in the server. Is it future-proofed against ad blockers and tracking protections? This is a very firm no. Nothing is future-proofed against those systems. The things like Safari's ITP not working against HTTP cookies is just a for now type of situation. Who knows what will happen in a year? Maybe we won't have any cookies anymore. But for now, using a server-side container is a pretty solid way to keep the best data quality in light of all ad blockers and tracking protections, as long as you still respect what the user is actually wishing and you're compliant with consent and any legal frameworks and any legal systems and rule of law that is valid in your and your visitors' regions. That's a legal disclaimer right there. How do I migrate a tag to server-side tagging? And this is a workshop style question, but obviously something that people want to ask. Right now, you just need to look at the developer documentation, check out the guides that I have in this slide, check out the videos. But currently, it requires a bit of coding because unless you're working with built-in tags like Google Analytics and Atlas Web, there are no built-in tags for Facebook or your favorite vendors at the moment. We're still waiting for the community gallery to come up. So you need to build your own clients and your own tags and your own templates. But migrating to Google Analytics is fairly straightforward. And there are resources, which leads me to the last question. Where can I learn more about this? Well, I have a slide of resources, which is very short. It's just me and Google. I'm that magnanimous at this point, but I do recommend to check out the official documentation. It's actually pretty solid. So I know Google gets often a bad rep about their documentation, but what they've been doing with tag management over the past year or so is just stellar. And their official documentation for server-side tagging will help you get things up and running. There's also a couple of videos that I did, one for server-side tagging deployment and one for building your own client template. And a client template is precisely what you'll need to start working with your custom vendors and getting them server-side. So I think that's a wrap for me for the official part, and I'm just really excited to jump to the Q&A. Is that okay?
I think that's brilliant. Yes. Thank you for that. I tell you, a little, thing I've been doing in the background here, my little guilty pleasure is I've been silently pretending like you're giving me a private training on Google Tag Manager. And there's this like fanboy inside me because I've known you for a while now, but just kind of be like, oh, this is super cool. I'm going to write all stuff down. So thank you for this. Not to mention the other 1,000 some odd people that are obviously here as well. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and dive. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I got to say, I mean, I'm barely containing my own excitement about this because this is such a cool thing. from so many perspectives, not just from a tagging or analytics point, but from a cloud engineering point of view. It's introducing so many people to the Google Cloud Platform. I'm just so excited to kind of get the message out. But I'm also a total fanboy when it comes to this kind of stuff. But I do believe that there's an inherent altruistic vibe to server-side tagging that I think many people would benefit from.
That's very cool. Well, let's go ahead and dive into the questions. So we're going to start. There's a lot of questions. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Any overflow, Simo's, we'll help answer those as well. So I'm going to prioritize these in terms of Tag Manager. There's some other ones as well, but we're going to talk about the server-side Tag Manager stuff first. Okay, just a few general comments about quality of page view counts going through the roof, which makes sense because you're having cleaner data coming through there. So Pac-Man was wondering if the stream consolidation is the same thing the service segment.com promises. Do you happen to know that?
I'm not that I've read up on Segment. I've used it years ago for a client, but I would imagine that they have the same USP. I mean, it would be ridiculous to build a server-side proxy without having consolidation of the streams. That's like one of the big promises involved in it. And I do, if I understand correctly, the way the Segment works is that you would send like a vendor agnostic payload to Segment, and then Segment fans it out to the different vendors, because that's just sensible. So in that way, I think there's a lot of commonalities between Segment, and I think that Segment is one of the biggest competition to server-side tagging from Google. But I'm not that familiar with the market research.
Good question. Julian was asking, our own Julian here, do you foresee that the server-side tracking is mainly used to replace client-side tracking, or do you think data will flow from a server, like the Shopify backend, to the server-side instance?
I think it's going to be a hybrid because this opens so many possibilities for server-to-server tracking as well, like purely server-side tracking. Just some scenarios that I have in mind is that, for example, there's just going to be a small amount of stuff running in the client that's absolutely necessary, like things like mouse interactions and scrolling and element visibility, just as a poor example. But stuff like that, stuff that's very difficult to grab from the server because you would need to send them somewhere anyway from the browser.
So it's kind of like layers.
Yeah, something like that, but definitely not as much as we have today. And then you combine that with stuff that you get from server logs, such as the page views. You combine that. And then the cool thing is that, let's take an e-commerce transaction, for example. You no longer have to burden the client with the full gamut of what was purchased, what variant, all the custom dimensions, everything. All you need to do is send an order ID from the browser to the server container. And then the server container can connect with your sales backend with the order ID and pull in all the metadata and then map it to the Google Analytics hit. So that's the beauty of it. That's how you combine those server-to-server streams with the client streams, is that you like the ultimate goal is to reduce as much as you can from the browser or the app from having to do any work, and instead use the full power of APIs and everything to combine the data. Obviously, we're also potentially stepping into legally dangerous waters because you're basically working as a data controller at that point, just combining different data. So again, compliance is very important here. But the potential for combining stuff that is only collected through servers, like accurate transactions, 100% accurate transactions, with a small amount of stuff that we still need from the client, I think that's where the promise is.
It makes sense.
Yeah, but I do think that obviously some people will use it only for tracking from the back end and tracking from a point of sale systems, things that don't have an active browsing client, and that's totally fine. But I think the use cases currently designed by Google have very much to do with replacing web tracking in particular.
It's kind of like you said, future.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Let's see, Julian was asking to server-side instance to fetch data from an API, process it, and then send it back to the client. So that sounds like,
for example, as well, that's possible as well. Yeah. One thing to keep in mind though is that, especially in Google Cloud, you basically pay for two things. You pay for instance hours and you pay for network egress. So network has ingress and egress. Ingress is when the data comes in. So you're not actually paying a cent for incoming requests. The site can send millions and millions and millions and millions of hits, and you're not paying anything for that network data bandwidth. What you pay for is the amount of computation that your server container needs to do. So obviously, if you're sending millions and millions and millions of hits, you're going to be needing more and more computation power, and that's what you pay. That's called instance hours. So it's the number of hours that those processors have to be churning. And the other thing you pay for is network egress. So everything that the server container sends forward, whether it's in an HTTP response back to the client or a hit to Facebook or Google Analytics. So when you start optimizing that cost, it might not be a good thing to send really complicated payloads back to the browser unless it's absolutely necessary, because that's where the cost comes up. That's when the cost starts creeping in, because you're sending huge payloads back to the browser and potentially introducing a lot of cost that could be avoided by just keeping everything within the server.
Okay. Bruce was asking, what impact do you foresee for sites which are using a commercial CMP, a consent management platform?
I think for now, I think these sites, that's a very good question. If these commercial systems use a cookie to kind of maintain the consent values, then things might not change that much actually, because the cookie can still be read from the server container. So you can still have like OneTrust or whatever running on the site, and you give your consent, and then it writes the consent in a cookie. And then when these requests are sent to the server container, assuming it runs in your own domain environment, they would include those cookies. And then in the server, you can then, unwrap those cookies. The thing that's currently missing, which I hope will be introduced soon, is an API to decrypt the TCF, IAB TCF 2.0 consent string. So the transparency and consent framework has a specific type of consent string that is trusted by vendors. For example, Google can automatically read that string. But it would be cool if you could actually decrypt that in the server container and use that to conditionally fire or not fire your tags. The other thing is that now that you don't have to block an entire third-party vendor because of consent, so if a Facebook cookie can't be used, you would block the entire Facebook script because it would need to use a cookie. But now that you're using a server container, if the user doesn't give you consent to use a Facebook cookie, you can still send something to Facebook as long as it doesn't include anything that was stored in a cookie. You can tailor those payloads by yourself. So this gives you a far more fine-tuned and fine-grained approach to consent management as well, because you don't have to blanket block everything. For example, in Europe, under e-privacy directive and GDPR, you wouldn't be technically, if you don't get consent, you wouldn't be able to drop any cookies, send any identifiers, send any personal data. But that just still leaves the out of sending a completely anonymized hit without any identifiers to Google Analytics, just so that you know how many times a page was viewed, how many times an event was sent, just to get like a hit counter.
Yeah, it's like the
so you can do this. Yeah, you can do this with server container. It's very difficult to do with the regular Universal Analytics web libraries. But yeah, it gives you just better tools for managing consent in general.
It's kind of a good transition into another question I want to make sure was asked. And I apologize for the mispronouncing the first name, but Alhosa, I believe, was asking, how does server-side tagging change the balance between marketers, right, who are now able to do self-service stuff and get everything done, and now that going back to that dependency on developers and kind of working with their teams? I know this is like a passion project of yours too. Like, what happens now with this?
Well, I mean, let's say in a year, I don't think that using a server-side tag, Google Tag Manager server-side, differs at all from using it on a web container. We're going to have the same templates, we're going to have the same tags, you can fire tags with triggers. You don't have to write a single line of code. The ultimate promise and the ultimate dream for most marketers for some reason.
Push button simple.
One that I steadfastly disagree with, as it being something of a good thing. So for now, it's a very technical platform because it's in beta and it has all these unpolished edges. You still need to write your own templates if you have a new vendor. But once the community gets up and running and starts producing those templates into the gallery, the deployment is a bit involved for now, even though it's beautifully automated to a very, very large degree. So just to get things running, you might need IT. To get those DNS changes, to get it running on your own domain, you'll need IT. But I'm just going to say this. I've been saying this for the last 6 years. Don't look at it as a bad thing that you have to communicate with the developers every now and then. They can be an asset. So instead of thinking like, oh man, now I have to go back to the developers, say that, yeah, I get to go back to the developers, because they can actually help you get everything running really, really smoothly. Just
I
my own
second that. Developers have a
pet
whole other
peeve.
view of the chessboard, right? Of what's going
Yeah.
on, and they can absolutely help. They are a tremendous resource.
And I think that this is a great olive branch to IT, because you don't need content security policies. You're not creating bottlenecks in the client anymore. You just need them to run a single service in Google Cloud, and you're kind of isolating tagging there. So they should actually embrace the idea of server-side tagging, because it removes so many pieces of friction that they typically object with when you discuss Google Tag Manager with them.
Brilliant. All right. So when it comes to the server, if we're reducing the client, there's a couple of questions around this. I'm just going to ask it in generally. When you're reducing client load, it's presumably increasing stress on the server. What's the performance of the server in this? How does that relate?
Well, technically, yes. I mean, if you're let's put it like this: there are many levels to this, and this is a very complicated question to answer, but let me frame it like this. If instead of downloading Facebook's JavaScript from facebook.com, you want to download it from your tracking endpoint.com, your own server-side container, then you're basically just shifting the library download away from the browser to the server, and the server has to do the computation, it has to download the script, and then it has to return it in a response. And the net benefit is only in the browser. The browser doesn't have to do that complexity, but it still needs to download the JavaScript from your server endpoint. So the only benefit there is that you don't have to add the vendor to the CSP, and you don't have to communicate with the third-party vendor in the browser. So it's not that great. But then when you chop it down, that maybe you don't need Facebook's JavaScript at all. Like maybe you don't need it at all. All you have to do is send a JSON or a JavaScript stream to the server that says an event happened with a purchase of this item, with this ID, with this value. And the server doesn't have to download Facebook JavaScript either. All the server has to do is compile an HTTP request that Facebook demands with those values intact and sends it to Facebook. And at that point, the net benefit is enormous. You're not downloading anything from Facebook servers. All you're doing is sending a ping to Facebook, which is super cheap performance-wise. It's a unilateral ping almost. You don't care about the response at all. So at that point, there is a very, very real cost benefit, both to the browser and to the server and to you as an organization. Obviously, you have to pay a little for that extra overhead of sending that hit to Facebook, but you're saving bandwidth both on the browser, which your visitors will thank you for, and most likely in your server-side tagging as well, compared to actually downloading Facebook's JavaScript. So there are many levels to this. There are many ways to tackle the problem. If performance is your interest, then that's what you'll have to look into. If just getting rid of those third-party requests is your interest, then you can get by with just proxying things from the server. So there are many approaches to this, but typically the net benefit is always positive. No, that's a horrible thing to say. It's mostly positive in many circumstances.
See that little filter in the back of your head. Go, nope, don't do the extremes.
I almost fell for the marketing spiel. It's never perfect.
That's perfect. Okay, that is mostly perfect. Okay, so we are not going to have time to get to all of the chat because we're going to wrap it up here in a few minutes. But get your questions in there. I'm sure Simo is.
And Jeff Sauer is next. You don't want to miss that one.
Exactly, with Jeff Sauer coming up. But in their few remaining minutes, let's try to get some other ones. Andy was asking, what are the debugging impacts for adding tags server side since data is not available in the browser console? It's a good question. So debugging.
So being able to basically see what happens. Well, from the browser users, for the visitor to your site, they're not very good. You're entirely reliant on the organization being upfront about this in their documentation, in their privacy policies. Maybe if they're really upfront, they'll actually respond something from the server. For example, when you send that stream there, it will return with an HTTP response that says, yeah, we send a hit to Facebook, we send a hit to Google. No one's going to do that. In a perfect world, that's how it would be. But you're entirely reliant on them being transparent and trustworthy. So this shifts, this is a bit of a paradox. This shifts the trust away from you having to trust Facebook to do well with your data It just shifts the same trust now to the organization. But from a certain point of view, I think that's better because the organization is there immediately. They are there, they are collecting your data, they are legally, they have to be compliant. Any fines that they get will hurt them much more than that they would hurt Facebook. So the companies do have a stronger incentive to be upfront about this stuff. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be bad actors. There definitely will be, and they're going to drag this beautiful thing down to the mud with them. And it's going to be a shame for everyone involved. But by moving the trust away, but the problem is transparency. And that's something that just, I can't even think of a solution for that because that's just the nature of client to server communications. What happens in the server stays in the server. It's like a Las Vegas of internet architecture. So it is just what it is. We don't know what happens there. And we just have to trust that they're respecting consent, they're compliant, they're respecting data processor controller agreements. It's a toughie. It's a tricky one.
And kind of speaking of what's visible, is the IP address visible when the request comes from server side?
I mean, you always what IP address?
So as Julian was asking, is the IP address visible when a request comes from the server side instance?
Well, I mean, you obviously see the IP address of the server, yes. But yeah, I mean when the browser sends a request to the server container, obviously that IP address is logged. It's a regular HTTP address. So your server container logs will have a list of all the IP addresses that's sent. But from that point, it's up to you what you want to do with that information. If you want to send that IP address to Facebook so that the hit seems to have come from the user's browser, you can do that. But you have to opt into that. By default, Facebook will only see the server container IP address.
All right, perfect. I'm going to scroll through some of these other questions here because I know we're on the final minutes. Again, if we don't get an answer to you, we'll do our best to do that. One of them was around server side. Once they get server side up and running, technically what they're asking here is, does it mean that they don't have to use client side anymore unless they want something that happens in the browser? So in other words, can server side just be standalone?
Yeah, I think I answered that. But basically, yes, you can have a server side endpoint that doesn't work with the browser at all. You probably want those layers, and if you want to track something happening in the client, then obviously you need code running in the client. It doesn't have to be WebGTM. I just use that in all my examples because that's the easiest way to get things running. It can be literally any piece of JavaScript that sends HTTP requests. So one thing that I'm kind of looking forward to is a proliferation of these small, really, really lightweight analytics modules that you run in your own site code, and their only purpose is to send these single streams of information to the server container, and then the server container fans them out. I think that's a very interesting future. So you don't have to use WebGTM at all if you don't want to. It just makes things a lot easier, but you could basically get rid of it in the long run and replace it with these lightweight data modules whose only purpose is to send information to a server-side tagging system.
Okay, perfect. And we'll just make this the final question. We're going to give this to Nitesh. Can the server endpoint receive webhooks instead of getting data layer from the front end using the client GTM?
If the webhook is an HTTP request, then sure. The server-side container digests HTTP request. That's the only way to communicate. That's the only way to communicate with a web server. So if whatever the source of information is, you can build a client that digests that webhook and then turns it into an HTTP, turns it into a vendor request or whatever. This is the crux of the thing. It's an HTTP endpoint to which you, at some point, obviously, being a Google Cloud product for now, we'll hopefully see integrations where you can initiate processes with things like PubSub or Cloud Scheduler or use cloud tools to initiate those streams. But for now, it's just HTTP requests. Really good questions, by the way. Very good questions.
And I'm glad you said that because there's a lot more back there. So
well, my weekend is wide open.
That's a challenge. All right, ask those questions back in the chat room. You heard it here live. Before we wrap up, we're about to go into Jeff Sohr, obviously, for Data Driven You, where Jeff's going to be talking about dealing with kind of the overwhelm and how you keep your focus and the chaos that has been this year. He's got some great tips where Julian and him had discussed those. Reminder that this particular session, for Simo's session, we will get up as fast as possible. Obviously, this one is quite literally live, so we are going to render it, get it all set up. up, and then we will get it. So it's not gonna be as fast as the other ones were, but it will be there. Ask questions in the chat, ask questions in the community Q&A. You know, Simo is obviously the most giving person on the planet when it comes to helping people. I just want to follow you around for a day to figure out how you do it, because it boggles my mind. Like, I just think there's Simo bots out there. I think he's got multiple Simo bots that are out there answering questions, but keep them coming.
This is a new prototype.
It's the new AI, the new Simo deep fake. Yes. All right. Well, with that, thank you again, Simo Ahava. Appreciate it very much, as always, for being a part of Measure Summit 2020. And coming up next,
My pleasure. My honor.
Jeff Sauer. Thanks again. We'll see you on the flip side.